In his inaugural speech, Barack Obama mentioned a name that may seem distant to many Americans, yet remains deeply embedded in the memory of the Vietnamese people, Khe Sanh. It was not just a battle, it was a place where the red earth absorbed blood, not only from American soldiers, but from Vietnamese ones as well. Men who dug trenches through the night, ate dry rations under the sound of bombardment, and waited for daylight without knowing if they would live to see it. Lyndon B. Johnson constructed a model of Khe Sanh inside the White House to monitor the battle. But no model could recreate what truly existed on Vietnamese soil. Villages left behind, jungle paths soaked in mud and blood, and civilians who had nowhere safe to run.
The world saw Khe Sanh as a major battle, a strategic focal point. But for those inside it, it was a test of endurance. Every decision made in Hanoi, Saigon, or Washington did not remain on maps or inside meeting rooms. It translated directly into consequences carried by people living on that land.
And to understand why Khe Sanh became the center of global attention in 1968, we must go back to an earlier moment, when the war seemed to have ended after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. But for the Vietnamese, that victory was never the end. It was only the beginning of another war, longer, more complex, and far more devastating. In 1954, after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the war against the French ended. But for the Vietnamese people, peace did not arrive in the way they had hoped. At the Geneva Conference, the country was temporarily divided into two regions along the 17th parallel. On paper, this was not meant to be a political or territorial border, but only a temporary arrangement before nationwide elections in 1956. However, in reality, that line did more than divide a map, as it divided families, villages, and people who had never imagined they would have to choose a side just to continue living. The agreement allowed civilians to move freely for 300 days. In theory, this was a right of choice, but in practice, it triggered an unprecedented wave of migration where decisions were shaped not only by belief, but also by fear, rumors, and what people were told. Hundreds of thousands, and then over 1 million people left their homes. Some moved south carrying little more than their belongings and memories of a northern homeland they might never see again. Others went north with different hopes, but regardless of direction, they all left behind a part of their lives. For many, this was not a political decision, but a decision of survival. And from that moment on, the war was no longer just about armies or governments, as it began to enter homes and villages quietly but irreversibly. During the 300 days following the Geneva Conference, the flow of people moving across regions did not stop. But this was not simply a migration, as it was deeply shaped by psychology, by information, and by what people believed would happen to them if they stayed. In many parts of northern Vietnam, rumors spread faster than official statements, stories of religious persecution, of future repression, of a closing window of escape. For many Catholic families, the decision to leave did not come from direct violence, but from an invisible fear, reinforced by repeated messages, by guidance from priests, and by narratives that became impossible to ignore. They left not because they had experienced war, but because they believed it would come to them in its worst form. Meanwhile, others chose to stay or move north driven by a different set of beliefs and expectations. But regardless of direction, the act of choosing itself became part of the conflict, because this was no longer just a war of weapons, but a war over human belief. Every rumor, every leaflet, every call to action could determine whether a family stayed or left. And as hundreds of thousands and then millions moved, the social fabric of both regions began to shift. Villages emptied in some places and became overcrowded in others. Newcomers had to rebuild their lives from nothing, while those who stayed faced a new reality where familiar faces disappeared within months. And from that point on, the war no longer existed only on battlefields, but also in thoughts, fears, and silent decisions where no one could be certain they had chosen correctly. Yet everyone was forced to choose. As people were still moving, and the wounds of separation had not yet healed, a new political reality began to take shape in the South, increasingly supported by the United States. The government of Ngo Dinh Diem was consolidated and defined as part of a broader strategy in which Vietnam was no longer just a country emerging from colonial rule, but a critical piece in a larger concern over the spread of communism, what the United States described as the domino effect. In this context, the nationwide elections, scheduled for 1956 under the Geneva Conference, never took place. And from the perspective of many Vietnamese, this was not simply a political decision, but a sign that the path to reunification through voting had effectively closed. replaced instead by a reality in which power was built through aid, advisors, and rapidly established political structures. While everyday life for civilians had barely stabilized after the previous war in rural areas of the South, these changes were not always visible through major declarations, but rather through more immediate experiences such as the presence of security forces, control campaigns, and a growing sense that daily life was being pulled into a new order that many did not fully understand. For many civilians, the war seemed to have ended in 1954. But within just a few years, it became clear that it had never truly left. It had only changed form, shifting from an anti-colonial war into a far more complex confrontation where the boundaries between politics, military action, and daily survival became increasingly blurred. And in that environment, decisions made far away no longer stayed confined to maps or conferences, but began to directly shape how Vietnamese people lived, what they believed, and how they endured in a country that had been divided in two. As the government in the South became more consolidated with support from the United States, a series of military and social control strategies began to be implemented with the aim not only of confronting armed forces, but also of separating civilians from influences considered hostile. Among these was the strategy known as special warfare in the early 1960s, which relied on the South Vietnamese Army, supported by American advisors, weapons, and aid. But for rural civilians, these concepts did not appear as doctrines, but as immediate changes in daily life. Most notably through the Strategic Hamlet program, where millions of people were required to leave their ancestral villages and relocate into fortified and tightly controlled settlements. In theory, this was meant to protect them and isolate opposing forces. But in reality, for many farmers, it felt like being forced to abandon ancestral graves, farmland, and a way of life rooted in generations. Within these new settlements, movement and daily activities were restricted. Traditional practices, such as weddings, funerals, and even basic mobility, became regulated. And over time, the sense of protection the program aimed to provide was replaced by a feeling of control and alienation. Some adapted while others resisted or tried to leave. And in such environments, the line between who belonged to which side became increasingly blurred. Because for most civilians, the central concern was not military strategy, but whether they could continue living on their land. When policies designed from afar failed to align with local realities, they not only struggled militarily, but also widened the gap between authorities and the people. And as a result, the war was not contained, but instead spread deeper into rural life, where each village became a space drawn into a conflict that civilians could not escape. As the government in the South became more consolidated with support from the United States, a series of military and social control strategies began to be implemented with the aim not only of confronting armed forces, but also of separating civilians from influences considered hostile. Among these was the strategy known as special warfare in the early 1960s, which relied on the South Vietnamese Army, supported by American advisors, weapons, and aid. But for rural civilians, these concepts did not appear as doctrines, but as immediate changes in daily life, most notably through the Strategic Hamlet program, where millions of people were required to leave their ancestral villages and relocate into fortified and tightly controlled settlements. In theory, this was meant to protect them and isolate opposing forces. But in reality, for many farmers, it felt like being forced to abandon ancestral graves, farmland, and a way of life rooted in generations. Within these new settlements, movement and daily activities were restricted. Traditional practices such as weddings, funerals, and even basic mobility became regulated. And over time, the sense of protection the program aimed to provide was replaced by a feeling of control and alienation. Some adapted, while others resisted or tried to leave. And in such environments, the line between who belonged to which side became increasingly blurred. Because for most civilians, the central concern was not military strategy, but whether they could continue living on their land, when policies designed from afar failed to align with local realities. They not only struggled militarily, but also widened the gap between authorities and the people. And as a result, the war was not contained, but instead spread deeper into rural life, where each village became a space drawn into a conflict that civilians could not escape. In the context of a prolonged war that could not be decided by a single battle, choosing a target became a strategic decision shaped not only by military considerations, but also by timing and broader impact. And among the locations in central Vietnam, Khe Sanh emerged as a site where multiple critical factors converged, located near the 17th parallel and close to key logistical routes from north to south. It was not only an American military base, but also part of a defensive system designed to restrict movement. From the Vietnamese perspective, attacking Khe Sanh was not simply about striking a base, but about weakening a crucial link in the opponent's control network, while also creating conditions to sustain and protect vital supply lines. However, Khe Sanh was neither the only option nor an easy target. What made it particularly significant was timing. The year 1968 was not only a year of war, but also an election year in the United States, where developments in Vietnam could directly influence domestic politics. Therefore, the timing of an attack was intended not only to gain battlefield advantage, but also to generate pressure beyond Vietnam itself. Within this logic, Khe Sanh became part of a larger calculation, where the objective was not simply to seize and hold territory at all costs, but to force the opponent to commit resources, to react, and to be drawn into a situation they did not fully control. And for those directly involved in preparing for this operation, it meant entering a campaign whose outcome would not be measured solely by victory or defeat at a single location, but by the effects it could trigger elsewhere, where war was fought not only with weapons, but also by forcing the opponent to disperse, to doubt, and to confront difficult decisions within their own system. Once Khe Sanh was chosen, the objective of the campaign extended far beyond that location itself and into what could be triggered elsewhere. Because within the Vietnamese approach, a major battle was not always intended to end a war, but to create conditions for simultaneous actions across multiple fronts. And in this context, Khe Sanh gradually became part of a broader plan of diversion where the preparation of forces, the movement of supplies, and even the selective exposure of information were used to shape the opponent's expectations. This was not accidental, but built on years of accumulated experience, as both sides had become accustomed to anticipating each other's intentions. Therefore, instead of fully concealing their actions, this time, the approach became more paradoxical as real preparations were carried out while visible signals were allowed to suggest that this would be the main direction of attack. Meanwhile, the actual focus lay in urban centers where the impact would extend beyond military outcomes into psychological and political dimensions. The timing was equally deliberate as it coincided with the Tet holiday, a period when normal rhythms slowed and both sides held assumptions that a large-scale offensive was unlikely. For those involved, this meant they were not only preparing for combat, but participating in a campaign where surprise was decisive, where success depended on what the opponent believed and how they reacted, and in this atmosphere Khe Sanh became a focal point drawing attention and resources, while other movements unfolded quietly in less expected places, turning the battlefield into a landscape where what was visible was not necessarily what mattered most. When the first shots were fired at Khe Sanh in early 1968, the area quickly became one of the most intense battlegrounds. But for those present, the battle did not begin with numbers or maps, but with long nights in trenches, where the ground was constantly torn apart by artillery and bombardment. The United States concentrated a large amount of troops, firepower, and logistical support into the area, believing it could become a native point. Supply flights arrived continuously, artillery fired at high intensity, and bombing missions operated almost without pause. Yet on the other side, Vietnamese forces did not engage in the way expected as they dug trenches, moved at night, and reduced the distance between forces, turning a wide battlefield into close-range engagements where overwhelming firepower was no longer absolute. In these conditions, every meter of ground came at the cost of effort and lives. Daytime could bring brief moments of relative quiet, but nightfall often meant distances shrinking to dangerous proximity. For American soldiers at Khe Sanh, the sense of being surrounded and uncertain about the broader situation grew stronger as they relied on air supply while living in constant anticipation of the next attack. Meanwhile, for Vietnamese soldiers, closing in on the enemy meant accepting greater risk, but also offered a way to limit the effectiveness of highly destructive weapons. And between these two approaches, Khe Sanh became a place where both sides were forced to adapt, where technological superiority alone could not determine the outcome, and where time, tension, and accumulated exhaustion became factors just as significant as ammunition. And throughout those days of fighting, what became increasingly clear to those involved was not who was winning, but how the cost on both sides continued to rise. While attention from the United States and its allies remained heavily focused on Khe Sanh, during the Tet holiday in early 1968, A series of coordinated attacks erupted across multiple urban centers in South Vietnam, from Hue and Da Nang to Saigon, and for many civilians, this was the moment when the war was no longer distant but appeared directly in front of their homes. Familiar streets turned into battle zones, and gunfire echoed through days traditionally meant for reunion. For the attacking forces, the timing was chosen not only for surprise, but also to exploit the disruption of normal routines. Yet for civilians, that same surprise meant they had no time to prepare or escape. They were drawn into a situation where the boundary between civilian life and battlefield nearly disappeared. In Saigon, the assault on key targets including the Embassy of the United States, Saigon created a striking image not only for its military implications, but for its symbolic significance. A location considered secure and tightly controlled had been breached, and this affected not only perceptions of the war, but also the psychological state of those involved and those observing from afar. However, behind these images lay a far more complex reality, as prolonged fighting in urban areas led to widespread destruction. For civilians, each day became a struggle between survival and confronting the reality around them. Some fled their homes in haste, while others remained and tried to adapt. And within that environment, there was no longer a clear distinction between front lines and rear areas, as everything became part of the war. For the United States and the Saigon government, this event represented a major shock, not only due to its scale, but because previous assumptions about the opponent's capabilities and intentions proved inaccurate. While for the Vietnamese side, this was not a single moment, but the result of a long process of preparation aimed not only at short-term territorial control, but at generating an impact beyond the battlefield. And it was within the intersection of what happened on the ground and what was seen from outside that the true significance of the offensive began to take shape. After the days of fighting during the Tet Offensive, what remained was not only damaged neighborhoods or shifting military positions, but also a change in how the war was perceived beyond Vietnam. In the United States, images and reports from the battlefield spread at an unprecedented speed, turning a distant conflict into something present in everyday life through television and media. For many Americans, the war was no longer about numbers or official briefings, but about direct visual evidence that raised questions about its purpose and whether it could be brought to an end. Events in places like Saigon, particularly highly symbolic moments such as public executions or attacks in central urban areas, created a shock, not only in military terms, but also psychologically. Yet while perceptions abroad began to shift, the consequences within Vietnam remained far more immediate and tangible. Families who lost loved ones, neighborhoods reduced to rubble, and a continuing instability that could not be captured fully in any single image. For civilians, the central concern was not how the war was portrayed, but how to continue living in a reality where safety was always uncertain. And this gap between how the war was seen from the outside and how it was experienced from within created a profound difference in understanding. For the United States, these developments increased domestic pressure as the central question shifted from how to win the war to whether its objectives were achievable at all and at what cost. And while political decisions began to reflect these changing perceptions for the Vietnamese people, the war continued as a daily condition rather than a single event, something they had to endure and adapt to. And within this context, the next phase of the conflict would be shaped not only by actions on the battlefield, but also by how each side interpreted and responded to what had just occurred. As the intensity of the war on the ground created mounting pressure, another front began to take shape, not through weapons, but through words, arguments, and positioning, leading to what became known as the Paris peace talks. Yet from the very beginning, entering negotiations was far from straightforward, as each side understood that not only the content, but also the structure and location of the talks could influence the outcome. Within this context, the choice of Paris was not accidental, but the result of multiple proposals and negotiations. For the United States, France represented a familiar diplomatic environment, with advantages in communication and global visibility. While for the Vietnamese side, accepting Paris came with its own calculations, including the opportunity to engage with anti-war movements and sympathetic elements within society. However, selecting the city was only the first step, as disputes quickly followed over how the negotiations would be organized, from who would be present to the shape of the negotiation table itself. Seemingly minor details, such as whether the table was round or rectangular, became symbolic of recognition and equality between participants. The Vietnamese side insisted that the talks must reflect all relevant parties rather than being limited in a way that favored one side, while the United States initially sought a more controlled structure, and throughout this process, it became clear that the negotiations were not separate from the battlefield, but an extension of it in another form, where every concession and every position was tied to developments on the ground. For those involved, this meant they were not only presenting arguments, but carrying with them the weight of losses, pressures, and expectations from an ongoing war. And within this space, the conflict continued, not through gunfire, but through persistence, calculation, and the ability to maintain position in a process where outcomes would not come quickly. As the framework of the Paris peace talks took shape, the focus shifted toward decisive exchanges between key individuals representing each side, most notably the meetings between Le Duc Tho and Henry Kissinger. Yet, from the Vietnamese perspective, this was not merely an intellectual contest between two individuals, but a continuation of a prolonged conflict in another form where each argument was not only meant to persuade, but to preserve what had already been paid for on the battlefield. During long and often tense private meetings, both sides sought to control the pace and direction of discussion. The United States, relying on its diplomatic experience, attempted to apply pressure through timing, conditional proposals, and even signals of potential military escalation, while the Vietnamese approach placed less emphasis on reaching quick agreements and more on maintaining position and avoiding concessions considered strategically harmful in the long term. For Le Duc Tho, this meant each meeting was not a place for compromise, but a test of the opponent's limits, where patience and endurance became as important as negotiation skill. At times, the talks reached deadlock when neither side was willing to shift position. Yet in those moments, the nature of the confrontation became clearer, as formal statements gave way to direct calculations about which side could endure longer. For the United States, the central question gradually shifted from how to secure a favorable outcome to how to withdraw while maintaining credibility. While for the Vietnamese side, the objective was not only to end the war, but to ensure that what was achieved at the negotiating table did not undermine what had been sacrificed on the battlefield. And throughout this process, the decisive factor was not a single argument, but the ability to remain consistent and endure over time in a confrontation whose outcome was shaped over years rather than in any single meeting. As the Paris peace talks gradually moved toward initial agreements, what became most apparent was not a clear and absolute victory for one side, but the transition of the war into a different phase where the intensity of combat might shift. Yet the consequences of the previous years continued to shape everyday life in Vietnam. For many families, the war did not end at a single moment, but persisted in memory, in irreversible loss, and in the changes they were forced to accept. Cities that had once been battlegrounds slowly returned to normal rhythms, yet the traces of what had happened did not easily disappear. For those who had taken part both on the battlefield and at the negotiating table, the outcome was measured not only by signed documents, but by whether the sacrifices made had led to something more lasting. On the other side of the conflict in the United States, shifts in perception and policy reflected how the war in Vietnam had left impacts far beyond its geographic boundaries. And it is within this intersection of what was achieved and what was lost that the meaning of the entire conflict becomes difficult to reduce to a simple conclusion. Because for those who lived through it, the war was not only about victory or defeat, but about what they endured and how they continued to live afterward. And as the story of Khe Sanh and the Tet Offensive reaches a point of pause, the questions they leave behind do not end there. Because what followed in later campaigns and final battles would continue to shape how this war is remembered, not merely as a sequence of events, but as a part of the lives of millions. And for that reason, understanding what happened requires looking beyond this moment toward what came next, where the war had not yet truly ended.